Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm doing another video review here. This time it's about a series of video segments which appeared in the High Performance Imports video series, all about tuning my R34 GT-t Skyline from dead stock up to running an 11-second pass. These segments appeared across, I think, about 5 of the DVDs, and I decided rather than uploading them individually, I put all of them together to create, a start to finish tuning story. The car is, I think, a 99 model ER34. So it has the RB25 turbo Neo engine. They were rated at 280 PS, which is 276 horsepower. So I'm just going to call it horsepower from now on. And that's about 206 kilowatts. As you may know, at the time, there was still a sort of gentleman's agreement in Japan not to sell production cars with more than 280 PS. There were some cars that claimed to be 280 PS and actually made a bit more, like the Supra and the R34 GT-r. But this car actually did make pretty much bang on that power. We did all the dyno work on a dyno dynamics dynamometer, which routinely gives you a power figure about 3/4 of what you would be getting at the flywheel. So when we tested it initially, it made 148 kilowatts at the wheels, which is roughly 3/4 of 206. So through the video, I'll do the conversions for you so you know roughly what sort of power we're getting at the flywheel from each of these mods.
Step 1 in our power up is a bunch of bolt-on parts from Japanese manufacturer Arpex. The standard cat back exhaust was the first to go, replaced by this Arpex GT spec system. Made from polished thin wall stainless steel, it not only looks much better than the standard system, it also weighs about half as much.
You can see how it pinches down at the end there because the standard catalytic converter was still being used. We were using this Arpex stuff because the new distributor in Sydney at the time just started advertising in High Performance Imports magazine, and I guess my ad rep made some sort of deal where we got a bunch of parts for the project car. Mind you, we also wanted to approach it the same way anybody else would if they were tuning a car, and the exhaust is pretty much always the first thing you do.
The piping is much larger diameter, so it sits a bit lower than the standard exhaust. Next to go is the standard front pipe. Once again, the Arpex GT Specs replacement is all polished stainless steel and comes complete with all the mounting hardware you need.
Again, you can see there that the flange at the catalytic converter was smaller than the pipe itself, but that's just the way they used to do it.
The slightly angled rear muffler looks great, and it sounds a lot better too.
All of the work on the car was done at Croydon Racing Developments, which was in Silverwater at the time, but they've moved now. As far as I know, they're still in Rydalmere. But anyway, beautiful CRT display they had back then.
That's more like it. A solid gain of about 10 kilowatts in the top part of the rev range. That's 10 kilowatts more at the wheels, which is more like 13 or 14 kilowatts at the engine.
Pretty good gain from a couple of bolt-on parts, although it really did only gain in the last sort of 2000 RPM of the rev range.
The car was still running at the standard boost level of 0.5 bar, so our next change was an Arpex AVCR boost controller. The kit is comprehensive, using its own boost pressure sensor and boost control solenoid. The display panel has cool blue graphics and lots of extra functions. As we still had the standard intercooler, we tried 0.7 bar of boost for the first run.
Those are Omori gauges that I put in, replacing the original 3 gauges on the cluster there. So I had a boost gauge and a oil tempered oil pressure.
The result was amazing, an extra 23 kilowatt across most of the rev range.
So just by going from 7.5 psi, 0.5 bar, up to 0.7, which is 10 psi, still pretty low, we've gone from 148 kilowatts at the wheels up to 181. So that's going from 280 horsepower at the engine. We've gone up to around 340 horsepower with just boost and exhaust system. And that is why JDM turbo cars from this era are so popular, because they pick up a lot of power with just a couple of simple mods. And take note of those stupid big Nike shoes I'm wearing there. Great big chunky walking shoes. I found out later, I'm not really ideal when you're on the track.
Inlet temperatures were already getting dangerously high, however, so it was time for the next modification, an Arpex GT spec intercooler. When you compare the size, it's not hard to see why the Arpex core works better.
At this time, all of the Japanese makers were sort of scrambling to make parts for the R34s. Most of the R33 intercooler kits would have a pipe that went up behind the headlight and across in front of the engine and then connected back around. So this Arpex one actually has a turnaround pipe on the second tank. So the pipe comes back along behind the intercooler and connects back up to the other intercooler pipes, which go basically the same direction that they did from the factory.
Once again, the kit came with everything, including hoses, clamps, adjustable mounts, and these fat blue intercooler pipes. Fitting the pipes is easy enough, but you also need to fit a pod-type air filter to clear the new pipes, and modify the bumper to clear the big intercooler core. It's a neat fit when you finish though. With the intercooler controlling our charge air temperatures better, we were able to run 0.85 bar of boost. This gave us another major gain, bringing the peak power to just over 200 kilowatts at the rear wheels. Next time we'll be fitting an Arpex Power FC computer to see if we can squeeze a bit more out of the standard turbo.
So this is about the limit of the factory turbo. It's only just under 13 psi, but the ceramic turbine has a habit of falling off the back of the turbo if you try to run any more boost than that. But at this point, we've got about 375 to 380 horsepower at the engine, which feels really good in a car that size.
Back in Australia, we're on to the second stage of our...
That sticker was on the back of the car when I bought it, and it stayed there. I've seen an awful lot of cars with that sticker because I believe that's the biggest Nissan dealer in Osaka, and I imagine before that they were also a Prince dealer.
Project car builder. The R34 still has the same suspension as when it left Osaka, so we visited White Line for some handling upgrades. Unfortunately, we had to wait for a few new shock absorbers to arrive from Japan, so we fitted the rest of the kit first. The easiest part is fitting the new Selby sway bars, which are much stiffer than the original items and have multiple mounting holes, so you can fine-tune the handling.
So I think the sway bars were identical to the R33 model. The shocks were different though. They had a fork type base at the rear and the lengths were a bit different. So we had to order in some shocks to suit. Back then, coilovers were really not that common yet. Most suspension shops wouldn't even know how to set them up properly. but I was using the car as a daily driver anyway, so I didn't really want it too stiff. So we just put a little bit stiffer springs, a little bit lower, and we ordered in some KYB Super Street, I think they were, adjustable shocks, which worked pretty well once they arrived.
Here we have used the stiffer setting. Urethane bushes and new links ensure quick response. At the front we have also fitted offset urethane bushes to the caster rods.
So again, things like adjustable caster rods weren't really readily available in Australia yet. You could get them from Japan, but they're really expensive. So it was a lot more cost effective at the time just to use an offset bush like this to get a little bit more caster.
Nearly 2 degrees of extra caster. The wishbone link bushes are also replaced with urethane, so when you're cornering hard, the geometry stays consistent. This helps the car hold its line through a corner. We've also fitted new springs to lower the ride height by 30mm front and rear. The links in the rear are also given new bushes to give a tighter feel. Most importantly, the main cradle bushes are replaced with urethane. This makes a big difference in the Skyline, as under high cornering loads the cradle can move around a lot with standard bushes. At a white line track day, we were able to test out the changes and also determine what the car needed next.
In Japan, those cradle bushes were called pineapple bushes. Some people call them drift pineapples. They are very important with the Nissan because the whole rear cradle can move around a lot. Being a nearly brand new car at the time, the originals weren't worn out, which if you have an older import, they certainly will be also. So now we get to the point about the shoes. When I first uploaded this video, somebody criticized me for not doing heel-toe downshifts at the track. I do know how to do heel-toe downshifts, but with those chunky shoes on, I found they were catching on the kick panel and on the floor. So basically, I just didn't bother. Ultimately, it didn't make all that much difference anyway.
Standard shock absorbers were the main problem, especially with the stiffer springs fitted.
You can see the car is bouncing around a bit because the shocks aren't really good enough for the springs we had in there. This track, by the way, is Wakefield Park near Goulburn in New South Wales, Australia. It closed down for a little while, but it actually reopened again recently, so it's still a track you can go to.
The standard tyres are also nothing special.
The standard wheels were 17 by 7.5, I think, and the tyres were only, I think, 215s, and being 3 years old and a bit worn, they were certainly not impressive.
Another problem is the Hiker's four-wheel steering. For normal driving this may be beneficial, but driving on the limit its interference is annoying. When leaving a corner with slight power oversteer, the Hiker's is constantly trying to correct your line, so you have to steer to counter it. This makes it impossible to hold a smooth line.
Bit of showboating for the camera.
One thing that was impressive at the track was the brakes. We had already fitted a new set of Apex GT spec pads to the front end, which uses large 310mm rotors and 4-piston calipers. At the rear we use less aggressive N1 spec pads, which don't have the sudden initial bite of the GT pads.
The brakes on a 34 are not too bad. They're half an inch bigger diameter discs than the 33 had. So they went from, I think, 297mm up to 310. The caliper was still the same though. It looked a bit different, but same size pads. So towards the end of that track day, I was losing boost, and by the very end, there was no boost at all. Because the turbo had done what all of those turbos do eventually, which is dropping the turbine off the back of the turbo.
In autosports, the problem soon became very clear. Lodged in front of the catalytic converter, we found what was left of the ceramic turbine wheel, so it was time to take the turbo out.
Here we have the stock turbine wheel out of the R34, R33 and R32 GT-t Skyline. They're all the same. They run a ceramic turbine wheel which do not take a lot of boost. Anything over about 13 to 14 pound, you will end up with a turbine wheel that looks like this, no head on it. We, in our modification, remove this wheel, replace it with the Stage 1 T3 turbine wheel, which has a steel head, allows you to run significantly more boost than the stock turbocharger. Its tip height, its blade height allow it to drive the compressor wheel harder, quicker. The turbocharger stays dual ceramic ball bearing, which allows for a quick response, early spool up with the turbocharger.
So as you probably guessed here, we're at GCG turbos, converting the old turbo into a high flow version and getting rid of the ceramic turbine, which is problematic in all of these cars.
You'll also notice on the exhaust side of the turbocharger, significant high flow.
You can see they actually machined out the housing to make room for the bigger exhaust turbine.
Turbine area, the gas gets away from the high flow turbocharger considerably quicker than the stock turbocharger.
The R34 compressor wheel is actually made of nylon with a slightly different design to the alloy R33 compressor. GCG fit a Garrett T4 57 trim compressor wheel, which is clearly much larger in every way. To fit this compressor, the housing has to be machined as far as it can go, leaving a very thin wall on the intake snout. So
that was a pretty popular thing to do back then. Because turbo upgrades were pretty expensive, most people would go for a high flow like that, where you put in bigger wheels and machined out the housings to make them fit. Unfortunately, it meant you had housings that didn't really perfectly match the wheels that you just put in them. But either way, you always got more power, and it was cheaper than buying an aftermarket turbo.
the small badge is the only clue that we now have a much higher flowing turbocharger fitted.
In case you're wondering, he wasn't doing up the bolts on the turbo with vice grips there. He was just bending the tabs on the nut locks. Fun word, nut locks.
At 0.95 bar of boost, the Power FC told us we were approaching the limit of the injectors, so we will need more modifications before we can make more power.
The standard injectors on the Neo, I think, are only about 310 cc, which is pretty small, and you can get more power out of them, but running injectors at 100% is never really a good idea. We used the Power FC because it was a very popular plug-in computer at the time, and it gave us all the tuning ability we needed for this sort of a build, and also probably because we got it for free.
This graph shows the power gain from fitting the Power FC alone. The power delivery is smoother, with around 7 kilowatts more power at the top end. Changing to the high flow turbo gave us a 17 kilowatt gain across the top half of the rev range, bringing the rear wheel power figure to 225 kilowatts. That's around 3.
Yeah, so at this point we're up to 225 kilowatts at the wheels, which is about 425 horsepower, which is quite a decent amount, honestly, in a fairly light car like this.
310 kilowatts at the engine. We decided to use one of OS Geekin's twin plate clutches in our R34 project car, which we...
Obviously at this point we were pretty much past the limit of the factory clutch, so rather than muck around we went straight to a twin plate, which was rated at 600 horsepower, and in my experience these can handle actually more like 700.
We had fitted at Rocco's Performance. The OS kit actually converts the clutch from a pull type to a push type using this double lever.
So that was one difference between the R33 GT-t, GT-s25T and the R34. The R34 actually used a pull type clutch like a BCN R33 GTR rather than a push type like the previous model. So in order to use a push type twin plate clutch, you had to have a converter kit that would change the motion of the release bearing. So essentially the clutch we're putting in is what you would have at an R33 GTR.
The new flywheel was part of the clutch kit.
You know, the clutch plates have got springs in them, just for damping the shock on gear changes. So while the clutch is not very easy to slip in traffic, it is a little bit easier on the gearbox than a solid clutch.
Center line on the bit.
Got it on there?
To test it out, we ran the car at the Auto Salon Drag Combat event at Willowbank with 26 by 8.5 inch drag slicks.
If anything, at this event we had more grip than we needed.
We're going to be running this until around about 2 o'clock.
Clutch was very impressive, but we noticed boosts dropping in third and fourth gear, resulting in a time of 12.8 seconds. The problem was the factory inlet pipe, which was sucking closed in the Queensland heat. Rocco's fixed this by replacing the softer section with an aluminium pipe. Back in place, it looks like a standard pipe.
It's a pretty common problem with Skylines once you get to about that power output, that the inlet pipe to the turbo will suck closed. Unfortunately, you do have to have some kind of flexibility in the pipe because the air box or the air filter is usually hard mounted to the body, and obviously the engine's moving around.
Next, it was back to Croydon Racing Developments for some more engine tuning. Here we fitted a pair of Tomei camshafts. These are the new pond cam design, which is specifically profiled to suit the Nissan variable inlet cam timing.
Actually, the head of the Neo engine is the biggest difference between it and the R33 RB25 before it. They had solid lifters, so the cam's completely different. And the Tomei Pong cams were designed specifically for that head. So they actually had lower duration than the cams that they supplied for the R33, but I think they had a little bit higher lift. At any rate, they certainly gave us good results.
To help control boost better, we also fitted this HKS wastegate actuator. This bolts up in place of the standard actuator, giving a base boost level of 0.85 bar. We reset the boost to 1.1 bar for dyno tuning.
Now, this was a trick I learned when I had the Starlet project car before this. Whenever you're using a bleed valve or a solenoid type bleed like the Apex unit, you need to have the base boost level of the actuator not too far below the boost level that you're going for, because if there's too big a gap, then it's very hard to get a smooth boost curve, and it just makes it hard to tune because the boost can move around a bit, and particularly at high RPM, you don't really know what you're going to get. So using an actuator that's close to what you want makes a big difference.
The result is a consistent 230 kilowatts at the rear wheels. Here we see our previous dyno graph. The blue lines are for the original turbo. This had better low down torque than the new high flow turbo, which was slightly slower coming onto boost. Fitting the...
So you can see the original turbo got up to full boost at about 85 kilometers an hour on the dyno. And then when we fitted the high flow, that became just after 100 kilometers an hour on the dyno. So there was quite a bit of lag there. But now you'll see the difference that the cams made.
Cams and boost actuator improved the turbo response at the bottom end, also adding 5 kilowatts at the top of the rev range.
So you can see there now the boost is coming up to full boost at about 90 kilometers an hour, so not much different to the factory turbo. And we're also getting the extra power at the top end. That's exactly what you want to see from a new pair of cams.
You may remember the original tyres were preventing us from enjoying the new white line suspension parts. The old Yokohamas were well worn and not really designed for hard track work, so it was time for an upgrade.
I got these wheels from Croydon Racing Developments as well. They were Racing Heart 18x8 and 18x9. I think they were called CPF Tune R. They weren't quite as expensive as Ray's wheels, but they certainly looked a lot better than most of the local options.
We chose a set of Falcon Azenis ST115 tyres, measuring 265/35 at the back, mounted on 18x9-inch Racing Heart wheels. For a start, you can see how much better we can get the power down now. There is also less steering needed to hold the car's line through a corner.
If you watch the right-hand side, you'll notice the car is just bobbing less in general, because at that point we've got the new KYB Super Street shocks in, which did work pretty well.
the bottom line, a full 2 seconds faster on this circuit.
Obviously, I wasn't using the start-finish line as the timing point. I used something that was easy to spot in the video. But yeah, the difference is 2 seconds, which is a lot.
The gain is even better on a quarter mile.
I think this video is actually from before the Willowbank video. Really, the point of this is just showing the difference between 3 different kinds of tyres and the amount you gain in terms of the 60-foot time.
2/10 off the 60-foot time and nearly a second off the ET. The next step up for street drag is a set of Nittos. These 245/50 16-inch tyres were imported from Japan. Our first chance to test them was at Heathcote Park.
It's a funny story because Nittos actually came from the US, but at the time there was no distributor in Australia. I found that pair in Japan and had them shipped to Australia, having already been shipped from America. Now it's much easier.
Nittos definitely benefit from a big warm-up and relatively low tyre pressure. That's another 2/10 off the 60-foot time, and another 3/10 from the ET. It's amazing how much you can gain just by changing tyres. Our project car has moved on to a more serious stage, so we're back at Croydon Racing Developments. To run more boost and a bigger turbo, we needed to change the head gasket to a thicker HKS metal type.
So the Neo engine actually had a little bit more compression than the previous RB25, which was not ideal once you're going for higher power outputs. So we put in an HKS metal head gasket, which dropped it down about half a point in compression, which just gives you a little bit more leeway in your tuning. And also, if you do have detonation, the metal head gasket will handle it better than the factory one.
This was a good chance to check the condition of the engine internals. The injectors were also changed to HKS 480cc per minute types before refitting the head.
480cc sounds tiny now, but it was actually about a 30% increase, I think, over the factory ones. And of course, we're running pump fuel, not the 85, so you don't need a ridiculous amount of fuel. Fully loaded head like that is heavier than you might imagine, so it's handy to have 3 people.
As an experiment, we tried fitting this OS Geekin adjustable cam gear on the exhaust side. Depending on the type of camshaft used, adjusting the timing can give useful power gains.
Yeah, often on an RB, if you retard the timing on the exhaust side, you can get a bit of a torque boost in the low end. But because the Tome Pong cams were already optimized for standard timing settings, we didn't actually get any power by putting that cam gear on there.
Next, we needed to make a manifold for the new turbo.
Okay, this is the big turbo that we got. GCG supplied it to us. They called it a 3040 because it had similar wheel sizes to an HKS 3040, but it was just a plain bearing turbo, nothing too exotic. The compressor cover was a 0.7. I think the exhaust housing was a 1.03, something like that.
TR3040 turbo would just barely fit as a low mount, but the manifold design would have to be perfect. Once the flange...
I wasn't really a fan of the high mount turbo manifolds that were available at the time. They just plonked the turbo a long way forward, and you had to move your power steering reservoir and a bunch of other stuff. And you'd also run into problems with heat soak in the bonnet and other things. So I really wanted to keep it a low mount, which meant making a whole new manifold.
Flange angles are set, the design process starts.
That's Adrian, I think his name is, doing the welding. We used steam pipe bends because they're constant radius inside and they're a thicker wall than your typical stainless manifold would use, so they are a lot more resistant to cracking.
It's like a jigsaw puzzle where you have to make the pieces as you go. The idea is to get each runner close to the same length with smooth joins and transitions. The manifold is trial fitted many times before deciding on the final design. The turbo also needed a slight modification, with this HKS bend welded onto the compressor cover.
We did this mostly so we wouldn't have to have a silicon bend right next to the exhaust housing, which gets super hot. So it's just a good reliability thing.
The manifold was bolted to another engine so we could get the angle of the Turbo Smart wastegate just right.
I haven't seen a Turbo Smart gate like that for a long time, but that was the latest thing when we put it on.
Before fitting, we had the manifold and dump pipes coated in ceramichrome, giving a smooth finish and some insulation.
Once again, we had an advertiser who was doing the ceramic coating. As one of the reasons why we had the ceramic coating done, but also looks a lot neater.
After a little more grinding for better flow, it was ready to go on. The wastegate lines and turbo lines are made first, as they are too hard to make later. Space is very tight, so the turbo and manifold have to go in together.
And basically, you couldn't have the manifold bolted to the engine and still get the turbo in there, so it all had to happen at once.
You can see how little room is left for the wastegate. The inlet pipe needed a return hose to link up with the new Turbo Smart blow-off valve.
I plumbed in the blow-off valve, just because by then I was getting a bit sick of the noise of blow-off valves in my other cars.
The inlet looks like a corkscrew, but it allows the airflow meter to sit in the standard location. To help tuning, we upgraded to a Z32 airflow meter, which meant wiring in a new plug.
With the Power C, you could change to the Z32 airflow meter quite easily. You just changed a setting on the hand controller, and that airflow meter, although it wasn't any bigger physically, it did have a lot higher range of voltage that it would read, which meant that at really high airflow, you had more information for the computer basically, so you could tune more accurately at high RPM and high boost.
The last job was making a new front pipe to meet up with the Apex GT spec exhaust system.
I'm pretty sure we never ran a high flow cat on that car. We were getting close to the point of needing one, but never actually happened.
After adjusting the fuel maps to suit the bigger injectors, Jim slowly brings up the boost and fine-tunes the Power FC. Soon the car was making enough power that it had to be strapped down.
If you watch here, Daniel, who's in the back of the car there, is listening and watching for detonation. You'll see a tiny puff of smoke from the exhaust pipe. That means that you're getting detonation. And to let Jim know, he actually knocks his hand on the back window so he can hear it.
At 1.4 bar a boost, we hit 281 kilowatts at the wheels. That's 50 kilowatts more than we made with the previous turbo. At this stage, we tried adjusting the cam gear, but with the Tomei cams, we found that 0 was still the best setting. Our final test was changing the small pod filter for what Apex call a super funnel.
That small pod filter was actually not suitable for the sort of power we were making. We could have run twin filters or a much bigger filter, but it was quicker and easier at the drag events to just put this funnel thing on instead.
Designed for drag racing use only, it simply helps guide air into the airflow meter.
You might notice there that the turbo's coming on boost at about 110, 115 kilometers an hour, so it's a lot more laggy than the high flow turbo that we had before. and ultimately it made the car not so great on the street. Really, this kind of setup is for drag racing.
This funnel gave a consistent 10 kilowatt gain across the top end, so it will certainly be worth using on the drag strip. At 291 kilowatts, we now have almost double the original power output. We had estimated that we'd need this sort of power to run an 11 on street tyres, so we went to Eastern Creek to try it out.
Yeah, so at that point we've got 294.7 kilowatts at the wheels. I think the most we saw in the end was 297, which is almost exactly double the factory power output. Bear in mind that we're doing this with standard pistons, standard rods, and on 98 octane RON fuel, just normal pump fuel in Australia. Obviously, these days people are running E85, and they're able to run a lot more ignition timing because of that, and they can make this kind of power with smaller turbos, or with the same size turbo they can make about another 30% more power. But you really can't compare those figures with what we're doing here. If you are actually running 98 octane fuel now, this tuning guide still gives you a pretty good idea of what you're going to get. The main things that have improved, apart from the fuel, is really the turbo technology. You can get much more responsive ball bearing turbos with better internal aerodynamics. So you can probably get around the 300 kilowatt mark at the wheels, which is 560 horsepower at the flywheel, without the sort of lag that we had in this car. From memory, it was really about 4,000 RPM before you had, at least a bar of boost. And we were running 1.4 bar, which is about 19.5 PSI. Sure did sound cool though, the open gate.
Couldn't get traction at the old Eastern Creek strip, so we took a long drive down to the Heathcote track in Victoria to try again.
Yeah, they were sort of the final days of drag racing on the main straight at Eastern Creek before they built the dedicated drag strip, and the traction was pretty bad. So as Ben mentioned, we went down to Heathcote.
Only just into the 11s, but it's good enough for us.
I didn't get many runs that day, and I was finding the car very hard to launch because there was more grip there. The car tended to bog down more easily, but if I gave it more revs, then it'd still break into wheel spin. So it was a bit tricky with those tyres. I did take it back to Eastern Creek once more, but then I broke a drive shaft. And I started to think, maybe I didn't need to do any more drag racing in this car. It was getting expensive. And also at that time, I just started my new company, Automoto, and I really needed money to get that going. So I sold the car at about that point. Bit of a shame because it was a really nice car, but everything has to go in the end. If you have any more questions about details about the build, there are a few things that didn't make it into the video. I'm happy to answer your questions. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.